Hey, good morning. It's Patricia Murphy. It's Thursday. This is Seattle Now. We hear a lot of talk about changing the culture of policing. Usually, it's from people outside of law enforcement, and it can be a tough sell. No surprise, though, it's also hard to do from the inside. We'll talk with Seattle Times investigative reporter Patrick Malone about one officer's story out of Tacoma. But first, let's get you caught up. The Duwamish tribe is making another push in its decades-long fight for federal recognition. The tribe filed a new lawsuit against the federal government yesterday. It says without the official designation, it's struggled to provide services to its approximately 600 members. Other local tribes, including the Muckleshoot, the Lummi, and the Tulalip, dispute the Duwamish claim. The Obama administration denied the tribe's last petition to be federally recognized back in 2015. Anxious parents are scrambling to find powdered milk and baby formula in the midst of a national shortage, but people in the Seattle area are mobilizing to try and help. The Northwest Mother's Milk Bank, which normally focuses on providing human milk to infants in NICUs or moms in need, is helping out. And a Facebook group called Find My Formula is posting updates about stores that have stock and helping connect families who have some extra on hand. It will likely be weeks before shortages slow down. And a highly contagious bird flu has reached Pierce County. The Department of Agriculture confirmed 2 new cases yesterday after owners of 2 backyard flocks called into the state's sick bird hotline. This makes 3 counties with confirmed cases of avian flu. The department is urging flock owners to avoid exposing them to waterfowl or shorebirds and not to share or sell their eggs. Law enforcement in Seattle and around the country are trying to do a better job of hiring officers that respect and reflect the communities they work in. But even if they do, it takes a lot to change culture. Patrick Malone is an investigative reporter at the Seattle Times. His latest story is called Black Police Blue Line: What Happened When a Tacoma Officer Challenged Institutional Racism. He's here now. Hey, Patrick, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me here.
So your story is about an officer named Valencia Brooks. Can you tell us a little bit about who she is?
Sure. Valencia Brooks was raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and fell in love with police dramas at a pretty early age, and it really just kind of got under her skin, a real sense of fairness and justice that, frankly, I think still exists today inside her. But, the dream was to become a law enforcement officer, and she made that happen. Went to the military right after high school and landed her first job at the Tacoma Police Department in 1989. She was there a couple years, went back to Michigan for a couple years, and then ultimately returned to Tacoma, where she spent her career until she retired in February of 2021.
Okay, so this was a lifelong dream of hers. There's even a photo in your article of a very, very young-looking Valencia on the day she became a police officer. And in your story, you detail her many attempts at taking on institutional racism at the department. Tell me one story, if you can, that shows what she was dealing with.
Well, I think one that's very illustrative of the overall circumstance during Valencia Brooks' tenure at Tacoma Police Department was a complaint she filed about a sergeant using the term hose to describe some black women who were accused of nothing more than potentially being associates of someone who was wanted for a crime. So these are just kind of everyday citizens, and that really struck her. She was the only black woman in the room, and she made the complaint, and there were 19 officers identified by the leaders of the police department to be questioned about this. And in the end, Brooks and 2 others affirmed that he had used hose in that context. 16 others provided different answers. Either, can't be sure if I heard that, or maybe I wasn't there after all. Things that called into question maybe whether this had happened, but in fact it did, and it was confirmed by 3 members. But maybe the most telling part of that was what was said by one of the officers who did confirm hearing that remark, and in fact sat in the front row and had a very clear shot at hearing that. He took great offense, not at the term that was used, but that Brooks would file a complaint over this. He said, "We need to be ourselves." And that raised some questions about who are they? What is the prevailing culture at Tacoma PD? And I think that one instance really sums up what Valencia Brooks was up against as sort of the prevailing attitude. And despite some very, frankly, saying the right things, the department was, and its chief was, they weren't always doing the right things when they had an opportunity to.
You said that she did file a formal complaint about it. She filed lots of complaints during her time at the Tacoma Police Department, 18 against her fellow officers, correct?
That's correct. They weren't all for racism. They were for things as close to all of our own experiences as people not abiding by the mask policy at TPD in the early days of the COVID pandemic. She took on a lot of things, and many of them were sort of minutia, really. But, the high-level ones that really grabbed our attention were use of offensive language, an officer's known past association with a white supremacist group, that he was even able to get hired and then get hired subsequently at another department where he works now. The thin blue line sticker that was mandatory on all patrol vehicles in the Tacoma Police Department. Brooks was the first to raise an objection to this, and I can tell you the date, February 25th, 2020, a week before Tacoma Police killed Manuel Ellis. And the response to that a day later was, "We will not," all caps, "remove the stickers." That changed, and only after community outcry about the stickers during the protests that were happening in the summer of 2020, at which point Don Ramsdale, the chief, said, "I hear you, community. I'm listening to you. I'm a community partner. We'll take those off." But, without ever telling the community, one of their own officers had already flagged this as a divisive symbol, and they had refused to listen to her.
What happened from those 18 complaints? That's an awful lot.
Well, the short answer is nothing. Of the 18, one of the complaints was very narrowly upheld, one very small sliver of it, and that had to do with training on stereotypes. And it was an unflattering depiction of black women carried out by a white woman who was the trainer, essentially mimicking a stereotype of a black woman. And that was the one aspect of one complaint that was upheld. And this kind of fits with the overall pattern at Tacoma Police Department. We learned that in the approximately 3+ years leading up to late 2020, approximately 85% of complaints vanished in the same way. They were rejected, or they were not upheld. Not sustained is the terminology that the police department uses for these. So what Valencia Brooks provided to us really is a unique window into accountability of how the Tacoma Police Department polices itself.
And notable that none of her claims was deemed to be unfounded, right? They just didn't rise to the level of what would be considered a violation.
That's highly notable because had they been unfounded, that would have, implied that the department did not believe what she says happened. But the way that they ruled that this circumstance did not rise to the level of a policy violation, the most common way that they responded to her complaints, that's kind of a judgment call, right? It's a little subjective. She often points out that, using the term hose to describe women in the Tacoma Police Department is well within policy.
You alluded to this just a second ago, but what does Valencia Brooks' story reveal about Tacoma Police Department?
Well, I think that in order to answer that, I need to give a little context in what was being said by the department's leaders while they were making these same decisions. And throughout that time, Donald Ramsdale was the chief of police, and he frequently added to the professional standards and the policies of the department. And these reflected good judgment. These were the kind of things that win trust with the community, saying we're going to treat every citizen equally. No one is going to get a lesser degree of service based on their race, their ethnicity, their gender, any of these traits. When, in fact, Valencia Brooks complained about an instance where a hate crime wasn't fully investigated, and that certainly would imply that someone from a protected group was not getting the same level of service. So all of this transpired against a backdrop, frankly, a very pretty picture that Don Ramsdale had painted of his own department with these public statements he was putting out. However, if you hold those up against the decisions he was making, and he did in almost every single one of these cases, he was involved in affirming the findings, it just showed a department that isn't who it says it is.
Well, and They said they were committed to hiring a more diverse force, to responding to the needs of the communities. In fact, they got $3.4 million in grant money to help diversify the force and tackle this issue.
They did, and it has been a monumental undertaking by the Tacoma Police Department and really the whole city of Tacoma. And I believe them when they say that they want to get those numbers up. They want a more diverse police force. The question then becomes, how do you build that? Do you build it from the inside out or the outside in? And in Valencia Brooks' opinion and her perspective, before bringing in more black officers, the department really needed to correct the way that black officers were being treated, and she didn't see evidence that that was happening.
Yeah, that's a really big question, Patrick Malone. Do you start from within or do you bring in new blood? Investigations always lead to more questions. What are the big ones you still have after reporting this story?
Well, I'm very curious how the city of Tacoma and the Tacoma Police Department are going to respond. What are they going to do with some of the gaps that became apparent and were reported in this story? A couple of them that seem rather important to me are some things that they already have in hand but have just decided not to explore or investigate. It's kind of like I'd love to see some curiosity from the Tacoma Police Department about itself. Some of these areas are these internal complaints, for instance, that have been rejected at such an astonishing rate. One of the questions that I asked was, okay, what's the percentage of black officers' complaints that have been upheld? And what is the percentage of white officers' complaints that have been upheld? And to take it one step further, what is the ratio of complaints against black officers being upheld compared to white officers? That's something that they have the data to analyze, but haven't. They've chosen not to. It's getting some fresh attention with this story, but internally they've known this all along. So how they respond, what are they going to do with this information? That's what I'd like to know.
And, the data points you're talking about could apply to all law enforcement all over the country. It might be worth looking into, not just Tacoma. But like you said, the will has to be there.
That's true, that in fact, some of these things transcend the Pierce County border, right? They go beyond that. And I can give you a very specific example. Very recently, my colleague Mike Carter wrote a very good story about some data that had to be provided by Seattle PD under its consent decree, its federal consent decree. And that involved use of force against various demographic groups. And it showed great disparity, that it was used at a higher rate against black people, just as we've seen it is in similar analyses in Pierce County, in Tacoma, and in other cities around Western Washington. But the real similarity between them was the gap. Even under a consent decree, the Seattle police did a pretty poor job about a third of the time not collecting demographic data on something that they're in a formal agreement. They agreed to do this, and it's got the force of law behind it, and they just ignored it. So, I think there is a pattern here that when there is certain data that might make a department look bad, especially as it relates to equity and treatment of people of color, it seems to be poorly collected and very often not easily accessible to citizens as it should be.
Patrick, Valencia Brooks retired last year. What's she up to now?
For one thing, she was very active in helping me to get this story out the door, very helpful. She provided a lot of documents and a lot of guidance and helped dispel a lot of my ignorance about the way police departments and their investigations work. But what she's doing now is just hoping to see change. From the get-go, probably from the first verbal complaint she very ham-handedly filed in 2007, then through the time that she became an absolute expert in it, and through this time of her retirement, the goal has always been to improve conditions for black officers and for black citizens, and all citizens of color, really. She still has that sense of justice that was instilled by Cagney and Lacey, and she's not giving it up. She's a righteous person, she's a braver person than I am, and she stood up to a lot of retaliation over the years, and I think at this point, having talked to her since publication, she's getting a lot of solace from the fact that there's been support and messages from the community that say, wow, Valencia Brooks, this was very brave what you did, and I hope it makes a difference. And that's what she hopes. That's what she's always hoped.
Patrick Malone, investigative reporter at the Seattle Times, really appreciate your time and your reporting on this. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for letting me talk about it with you.
Thanks for listening. Jason Pagano produced today's show. Matt Jorgensen does our theme music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.